let's get started. So I should first of all want to thank everybody for coming. It's been fantastic, and I want to especially thank our fantastic guest speakers for their wonderful talks. I've been really overwhelmed by them. I should start by saying I have fantastic collaborations here at the University of Iowa, including with the members, of the collaborative. So it's a little bit perverse of me to take this opportunity to talk about collaborations outside the group, but this is data that's hot off the presses and I'm still struggling with it, and I'm interested to hear what you think. It's a really nice collaboration for me I have with Ian Koch at Aachen University and Daniel Weissman. You may know him as Daniel #2 at the University of Michigan. The three of us have been talking about binding. I'm the farthest west, so it's been early in the morning for me. I rush back from dropping my daughter off and have these long 2-hour conversations about what binding means. It's been exciting. So that's what I'll be talking about today, looking at binding effects in 2- and 4-choice tasks. So just to be clear, let me start by describing what binding effects are, in case you don't know. They're a diverse, I'm sorry, I'm messing with my settings because I can't see, maybe I don't need to see. Well, anyway, the binding effects are a diverse phenomenon, and I should describe them to you in a little bit of detail because they're not always the same phenomenon. So here's data or description of binding effects from Hammel's Tix paper in 2004, talking about various instances of binding effects. You can see on the upper left-hand corner, it's a sequence of choice RT tasks where the subject is responding to the location of the red stimulus, and you're faster when the location repeats. You're also faster when the orientation repeats. And when the location switches, you're faster when the orientation switches. And then in the upper right corner, we have an example of a case where you're faster making a left foot response when you are thinking of a right finger press than when you're thinking of a left finger press. And this happens across perception and action as well. So if we look in the lower left, you're better at detecting a leftward set of arrows when you're making a right response than when you're making a left response. And in the bottom, we have the data from what's called the partial repetition cost procedure, which is designed to look at binding effects. And here you're faster making the same response to the same stimulus than making a repeated response to a different stimulus. So the main point here is that binding effects refer to changes in performance resulting from overlap between stimuli, responses, or effects on consecutive trials. In other words, we're looking at how much we see a cost when individuals have overlap from the previous trial to the current one, and that overlap isn't complete. And the idea here is that this partial overlap has led to the recall of an episode that conflicts in some way with the current information, and this new episode needs to be unbound so that the current episode can be encoded. And it's an interesting feature of binding effects that there's no single agreed upon behavioral signature, but we see these effects of partial overlap, this cost of partial overlap compared to complete overlap or no overlap in a range of phenomena, and we call them binding effects. And this is why they get proposed as explanations for a tremendous range phenomena. And another interesting thing to me about them is that these effects are usually pretty small. As you can see, if you're looking at the y-axis here, they're in the neighborhood of 10, 20, maybe 30 milliseconds, but they tend to be fairly small effects, but they tend to be quite robust, and you don't need a lot of subjects. So who cares? And maybe this audience don't have to do a lot of selling on this is why this is an interesting phenomenon, but I'll tell you my first 2 or 3 years in the department, so a long time ago, I was giving a talk on binding effects, and someone not in the cognitive area asked me, Eliot, these are 20, 30 millisecond effects. Why do you care about these at all? And it's a totally fair question. And if I had been a smart, think on my feet kind of person, I would have said, that's an interesting question, given that we're in the exact room that the Simon effect was discovered, because we were. It was the old Dick Simon's lab had been converted to the colloquium room, and this is where we gave brown bags. So I should have been smart and given that comeback, but I'm not the snappy, quick-witted person. I'm the kind of person who thinks of the snappy comeback 15 years later and then figures out how to work it into conversation. And so what I said was, well, response selection is mysterious to me. It's what I want to understand. And I'm looking for any clue I can as to how it works. And the idea that when you do a response selection operation, it leaves a trace in the system, and then I can, with the next trial, look at that trace and get a good handle on what's encoded. This is exciting to me, and it's going to help me understand how response selection works. And maybe even better, more elaborate answer would be to rely on the theoretical work of Wolfgang Prinz and Bernard Hamel and Christian Frings, who have talked a lot about why binding might be really important and how it might be essential for the control of voluntary behavior. I mean, part of the idea is that when you bind the events associated with the selection of a response together, you're binding the stimuli, the response, but also the action effects, the results of your action together. And this is very useful if you want to select your action based on the effect. So we're now able to select responses not just based on the stimuli, but actually based on the desired outcomes, which is great if you want to answer your phone not because it's ringing, but because you want to talk to who's actually on the other end. And that's a very useful feature, that we're able to select our behaviors not just based on what's happening in the environment, but based on what we want to make happen. It's also true that using binding helps you select action based on previous action. So the idea that partial information that's available to you in the environment may help you select a response even when you don't have the rest of the information might be useful. So it's a way of sort of helping response selection based on previous experience. And it's also a way of using multiple sources of information to integrate multiple sources of information. And so, you know, if you're looking for berries, you don't just have to, you might not rely on seeing the actual berry, but you might also be driven partly by seeing the leaf that's associated with that berry. So it's a way of integrating multiple sources of information to speed your selection up. And for these reasons, because people think it's essential for guiding voluntary behavior, there are some interesting models about how binding might work. And I'm going to review them not so much to get a good give a good mechanistic understanding of binding, but to sort of give you a sense of how theorization about binding has changed maybe over the last 20 years. So the obvious place to start again is with the Hamel review paper. And here the idea of binding really built on, and it continues to be built on, Danny Kahneman's object files idea. So Danny Kahneman was talking about how perception was about building these objects, which were integrated collections of features. Bernard Hamel took this point and made some important changes. One, he made location less essential or less not the primary key by which the files were indexed. And another important innovation is that he added response features to the file so that they weren't just about the stimulus, but about the response associated with them. And the idea is that when you made this response, all this information got integrated together, and then it was used in subsequent response selection events. And the one sort of interesting manipulation is there's this task relevant salience box you see in the sort of lower left that controls how much each feature is integrated in the event file. So things that are really important in driving your behavior may play a larger role in the event file than information that's not so essential. So there's this wiggle room as to actually what exactly gets encoded in the event file. A more recent, very elegant computational model from James Schmidt, the parallel episodic processing model, captures a lot of these ideas. On the right, pathway up is what you might call the instructed pathway, where the information in the environment drives the behavior through some set of instructed rules. But on the left side, you have these episode nodes, and these are really a lot like the event files, and they're the integration of the information that also gets associated with the response. So when you activate these episodes, you also activate the response. And so it's similar to the event file idea. It's a nice computational model, so it provides rigorous predictions of a range of effects, from the power law of learning to CSE and other behavioral phenomena. And the one interesting thing, or well, there are many interesting things, but one thing to note in this model is these episodes are not just linked to responses, but they're actually also linked to a response threshold. So when you activate an episode, you can adjust the response threshold, how much activation response needs to sort of fire. So each episode is also connected to a control parameter. And as Julie noted in her talk, this sort of feature allows the model to accommodate a lot of effects that you wouldn't intuit episodes or these specific episodes to be able to capture. A final model I want to talk about is the recent binding and retrieval of action control, or BRAC, B-R-A-C model. It also describes how event files the binding and retrieval of event files can explain a huge range of phenomena. The interesting feature with this model for our purposes is now the event files have really grown, and it's not just stimulus information and response information and the effect information, but now we're including things like the cues, the context, the decisions, the affect associated with the response. So these event files have gotten quite large, and this poses the question, like, what exactly is an event file? Is in an event file? How do we know what gets encoded, what really is going to drive the retrieval of the event files? And I'm going to be talking about this in regard to a very specific experiment. You can see I'm running short of time, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly, but evidence for the retrieval of specific episodes is extensive. You can see it in congruency sequence effects, task switching. In fact, the data that David reviewed by Kikumoto and Mayer talks about event files driving some of these signatures in the EEG signal. It's part of negative priming, dual task phenomena. Julie talked about how it's been used to explain parts of list-wide congruency effects and partial repetition costs, and many more. But the dynamics and content of this encoding and retrieval processes are not well understood. So we really don't understand what gets encoded and how that relates to what the subject is actually trying to do. So that's what I'm going to sort of quickly try to talk about in these experiments. And the first thing I want to point out is that in many cases, particularly choice RT, where I spend most of my time, you can think about binding as having two parts. There's the complete repetition advantage, which is how much faster you get when everything repeats compared to when everything so when you're making the same response, you're faster when everything in the display repeats compared to when the task relevant information repeats, but the task irrelevant information changes. And that's this complete repetition advantage. I saw a red line, red line at the top both times, but I'm faster when the red line was vertical in both cases than when it was horizontal in the previous trial and vertical in the current one. So this idea that when I'm making a repeated response, I want everything to repeat. That's the complete repetition advantage. But there's also a complete alternation advantage, and that's you're faster making an alternative response when everything changes compared to when there's some overlap with the previous trial. So there are these two parts, and Humble has explicitly argued that these are really two sides of the same coin, that what really happens is that in either case, you have to encode the current event, and if the event has some overlap with the previous one, you're going to retrieve this previous one, and that's going to lead to trouble if there's any overlap with the current one. So you should see a complete repetition advantage or a complete alternation advantage. They should be basically the same. But the point is that they aren't always the same, and we don't really have a principled reason for thinking they aren't, understanding why that might be. In this example, you can see the effect sizes are small, but the complete alternation advantage is about half what the complete repetition advantage is. So how did the number of SR alternatives, so I'm going to look at this by manipulating the number of SR alternatives. And why is that a good way to look at this question? Why care? It sounds pretty small potatoes. Well, the thing that appeals to me about using the number of SR alternatives is this is a manipulation that doesn't affect the display at all. So the display is unchanged, and you always have a single item. I'm not adding conflict. I'm not making anything more complicated. You just have a single item. And the number of SR alternatives has a powerful effect on response selection, how long it takes, and presumably affects retrieval. So you might think it's an interesting place to look at these effects of the retrieval of these SR bindings or these event files. There's a more sort of empirically driven approach, and that's that some work has shown that you don't really see complete alternation costs in 4-choice tasks, that most of the reports of these complete alternation costs have come from 2-choice tasks. And I published a paper many years ago where I didn't see it in 4-choice tasks and proposed that really it was because there was no single alternative response to make, and so that couldn't get inhibited, and that might be the reason. But no one has, as far as I know, has systematically looked at this until Earing and Daniel too, and I started debating about all this. In the course of our discussions, we sort of hit upon what I'll call the signaling account. And this is the idea that when you're doing these tasks, a lot of times when they're 2-choice, if it's red left key, green right key, it doesn't necessarily feel, at least when I do them, that you're saying, oh, red, okay, I'll hit the left key. Oh, red again, I'll hit the left key. Green, okay, I'll hit the right key. It's more that you're looking for a change, and that you can do this task simply by saying, if the stimulus repeats, I'm going to repeat the response, and if the stimulus switches, I'm going to switch the response. And that's a very easy, straightforward way to do the task, and it works very well in a 2-choice task, which might make it different. Before I go any further, I should thank Daniel Weissman for coming up with the term signaling. I wanted to call it something clunky like transitional congruency, and I think signaling is a lot better. So this is Daniel's term, but the idea here is that with a one-to-one mapping, you can use the change in the relevant feature to signal a change in the response, and that's all you need to know. If it's a 2-choice task, did the relevant feature change or not? And then you do the same thing with the response. And in the 4-choice task, the first rule, if the relevant feature, in this case the color, repeats, you can repeat the response, works well. The second rule, not so much. So how can we tell if subjects are using this rule and whether it has any role in these effects? So let's just move quickly. So I think I've explained the logic. If you're using signaling, then when the color repeats, responses should be faster when the location repeats, because the location can be used as a cue too, and you might use the location as a signal. So the idea is, if I look at location, if it's repeating, I should repeat my response, and if it's if the location alternates, then I should be faster making an alternative response. So, and the key point here is, if you're using signaling, you should get the same prediction that binding gave us, and that's a problem. That this idea that you're using signaling can explain both these effects. Signaling says, I looked at location repeated, so I wanted to press the repeat key, and that's going to look exactly like a binding effect. You're going to get an alternation. I'm sorry, you're going to get a complete repetition advantage. And if the location changes, it's going to tell you, well, maybe my response should change, and you're going to get a complete alternation advantage. So the point is that without worrying about binding at all, signaling can make the exact same set of predictions, which is a problem. In the 4-choice task, things are a little bit different. And when the color repeats, you still want to press that repeated response. And so you're going to be faster when the location also repeats, because you're using that location as a signal, but not so much when the color alternates, because now when the location alternates, there are still 3 other alternative responses, none of which are uniquely signaled by the new location. So you can't really use this rule because you have 3 alternative responses when the location switches. So it only works half the time. And so you should get a complete repetition benefit, but you no longer get the complete alternation benefit from signaling. So now let's just see if this happens. Let's just do the experiment. So I did a 2-choice task. It's a very straightforward task. You saw a color on the top or bottom of the screen. Location was irrelevant. You responded one way if it was green, another way if it was red. I'm not even going to tell you. It's an assignment task, rotated 90 degrees, so there's no conflict. I'm a conflict avoidant person. And we just ran a few trials over the internet. It was the first time I did an online study because of COVID, and it seemed like a good way to start. Nothing very complicated about it. And here are the data, and you get the classic interaction. You're faster when the color repeats, you're faster when the location repeats. When the color alternates, you're faster when the location alternates. You get the color by location interaction. This is the hallmark of binding. Complete repetition advantage, 25 milliseconds. Complete alternation advantage, 25 milliseconds. Everything's great. It looks like binding, but it also looks like signaling. Nothing's hiding in the accuracy. In fact, you see it beautifully in the accuracy as well. So we met our predictions. The problem is that these predictions are the same for signaling and binding. Let's look about 4-choice. In 4-choice, the signaling tells us a different thing. It tells us, well, you should still get the complete repetition advantage, but the complete alternation advantage should go away, because switching location should no longer uniquely indicate a competing response. So signaling makes this prediction that the complete alternation advantage goes away. Binding says, well, no, you should still retrieve this episode and have to unbind the parts, and you should still see the same complete alternation advantage. So what happens? We did a 4-choice task. It was very simple. There's 4 colors. It slightly changes the proportion of probabilities, but most of our data are on the repetition side, where we're making a different prediction, where the binding and signaling counts are making different predictions. So in a way, that's advantageous. What happens? Here are the data. I should remind you that the scale has changed. You can see you get a location by color interaction, the color by location interaction, highly significant. So you'd say, great, I've seen binding again. But if you look at the pattern, it's a little different. The color repetition advantage is unchanged. It's 23 milliseconds. It was 25 milliseconds in the previous experiment. But my complete alternation advantage has disappeared. And it's not hiding. So this looks like signaling, not binding. Okay, so this doesn't seem like binding. The signaling hypothesis is favored. If I show you the accuracy, the same story. There's no indication that there was a complete alternation advantage hiding in the accuracy. You might say, well, those RTs are really different. Is there any evidence that they diminish? Is there any evidence that the complete alternation advantage diminishes with RT? There isn't. It's flat in both the 2-choice and 4-choice task. Same is true for the complete alternation advantage. Obviously, I don't have time to tell you. Okay, so we see that the interaction associated with binding is robust in RT, but this complete repetition advantage stays unchanged. Complete alternation advantage goes away. This is consistent with binding, this is consistent with signaling, not binding. So it seems like maybe binding isn't happening. Back to the who cares question. I'm sorry, I'm rushing a little, but we need to be careful about how we generalize from 2 to 4-choice tasks. These conclusions about complete alternation advantages being the same as complete repetition advantages would never have happened, I don't think, if we had relied on 4-choice tasks. This is sort of a pedantic point, but I think it's worth making, that our picture of how the sequential effects really happen have been shaped largely by the prominence of two-choice tasks in this literature. The other important point is that signaling appears to play a large role in choice RT tasks, and I still use choice RT tasks a lot, so I want to understand what the underlying representations look like, and the idea that subjects are using a change or a repetition of a stimulus feature to drive their behavior maybe more than the actual color or actual feature itself seems to have wide-ranging implications that we might talk about later. And then the other point is that these relational or derived features play an important role in the encoding of stimulus and response information. This may be important for a lot of these models, which seem to neglect derived or relational features in favor of the color and shape, which we know are represented in the brain. But when we look at the behavior carefully, it looks like things like switch and repeat seem to be just as important for driving behavior. This would be a great place to stop, especially since I'm running over time, but I'm going to just very quickly go through the last part of my talk, and that's, I made a big deal. We've seen, all these great talks about MVPA and RSA and all these fancy analyses, and here I am making a big deal of this no effect. Like, this is the cornerstone of my data. I feel a little bit inadequate, but I want to just probe this a little bit more to make this to get at the point that, can I really see anything going on here? Can I learn any more? So should we really give up on binding? We know that binding is robust across a range of procedures. Am I saying it's all hooey? Do I want to stop caring about all these other procedures? Maybe not. And maybe what I've shown is that the actual color and the actual location don't get bound so well, but what really seems to get bound are the ideas that if you repeat or switch, that's the information that gets encoded. And if you think that repeat and switch are what gets bound, then maybe these are what produce the sequential effect in these. So follow me down the rabbit hole, and we're going to check this out, whether we see binding effects with these concepts like repeat and switch. And here's my fancy glare effect for going down the rabbit hole. Okay, so I really want to rush. So the question is, do we see a benefit of a valid signal? A valid signal means that the response did the same thing that the location did. If the location changed, the response changed. If the location repeated, the response repeated. Is this the same? On half the trials, they're the same. On the half the trials, location and response do opposite things, so there should be no net effect. But if binding is taking place, there should be a sequential effect. And I'm going to skip the logic and just give you the punchline. Location repetition should be slower after valid trials, because location repetitions are when the location repeated, the color did not. That's a bad signal. The location stayed the same, the response changed, so that should be slow. Whereas complete alternations where both changes, they should be slower after invalid trials. Is this true? This is an exploratory analysis, but we have about 60 trials per subject. So I'm looking more closely at my null effect. We have the invalid trials and the valid trials, and when I break them up by whether the previous trial was valid or not, I get my crossover interaction again. And it's significant, it's true for both trial types. It's also true in the two-choice task. So it seems like in the two-choice task as well, people are using repeat and switch as an important way in which they encode the responses. Okay, so bottom line, derived features appear to be encoded and bound. We seem to be encoding what we do in terms of repeat and switch as much as the actual color and the actual response. And these binding effects can reveal how stimuli and responses are encoded. I think that's sort of the power here, this idea that we can use these sequential effects to look, or these binding effects to understand how the brain is actually processing these individual trials and get a clue as to the underlying representation. And I thank you for your patience and your time. Thank you all very much.